Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on Fred Hampton.
Oh, wow.
You guys sent over a ton of stuff about him, including some really interesting excerpts from that Mr. Hutchings History podcast.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Clearly, you're all interested in his role in the Black Power movement.
Right.
And honestly, who wouldn't be? I mean, the guy is still sparking debate today.
Absolutely.
So where do we even begin with someone like Hampton?
Well, you're right. He really does continue to fascinate us.
Yeah.
And challenge us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the best place to start is just by acknowledging that he really embodies the complexities of the movement.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, the drive for social justice,
Right.
the revolutionary spirit,
Yeah.
and all the risks that came with pushing back against the status quo. What was it about the material that really jumped out at you?
I think, aside from the fact that he did so much so young,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, leading the Black Panther Party in Chicago by 21.
It's incredible.
It's mind-blowing. But what really struck me was how he operated. It
Right.
wasn't all just fiery speeches and protests. He
Right.
was really deeply involved in his community.
Yeah.
The podcast mentions those survival programs, like the free breakfast for kids and the health clinics.
Yeah.
It's like he understood that real change has to start on the ground level,
Absolutely.
meeting people's needs right now.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
I think Hampton's approach was different because he saw that revolutionary change wasn't all about ideology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it had to be about action, things people could actually see and use.
Yeah.
So those programs weren't just charity.
Right.
They were very strategic.
Go.
They addressed those basic needs, built trust within the community,
Yeah.
and ultimately they were a very effective way to recruit for the Panthers.
It's smart.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even just about drawing people to the Panthers.
Okay.
It was about uniting everyone.
Right.
Like this whole idea of the Rainbow Coalition, bringing together groups like the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, even poor white communities.
Yeah.
That feels so radical for the time.
It was radical.
Yeah.
And so forward thinking. Think about it. He was basically laying the groundwork for intersectional activism decades before that was even a term.
Wow.
He saw the common struggles of marginalized groups,
Right.
regardless of race.
Or ethnicity.
Exactly. And recognizing that by uniting against a common enemy, in his view, capitalism, they could actually build a more just society.
So he's bringing in some pretty heavy Marxist ideas here, right?
Well, yeah, Marxist ideas were definitely a part of his thinking.
The podcast mentions that his thinking was influenced by Marx.
Right, but it's important to not oversimplify things.
Kind
He wasn't just repeating what he'd read.
Right.
He was adapting those ideas to what he saw in his own community. He saw firsthand how capitalism created and perpetuated inequalities.
Yeah.
And he believed that collective action was the only way to dismantle those systems.
It's interesting how those ideas still resonate today.
Yeah. I mean, we see similar movements pushing for social and economic justice all the time,
Absolutely.
recognizing that those issues are tied together.
That's what makes studying Hampton so relevant, you know?
Yeah.
He was ahead of his time in so many ways. But sadly, his vision, his success, and his growing influence,
Right.
it also made him a target.
Right, because that's when the FBI enters the picture.
Exactly.
The podcast talks about COINTELPRO. This secret FBI program meant to take down groups that they thought were subversive.
Yeah.
It's scary to think that the government was actively working against social justice movements.
It's a dark chapter, you know?
Yeah.
And the tactics they used against Hampton were especially bad. We're not just talking about surveillance here.
Right.
We're talking about disinformation campaigns,
Yeah.
psychological warfare,
Wow.
even trying to create conflict within the Black Panther Party.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the level of paranoia and distrust that created.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
So they saw Hampton as like this incredibly dangerous figure.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Something
yeah.
to stop.
He was young, charismatic,
Right.
and so effective at building bridges between different groups. His message of unity and self-determination was a direct threat to those in power.
Yeah.
And don't forget, this is during the Cold War.
Right.
So when he starts talking about socialist ideas, it just makes those fears even worse.
So the stakes are getting really high now.
Oh, yeah.
We have Hampton, this rising leader with this radical vision.
Right.
And the entire FBI is trying to take him down. What happens next?
Well, this is where things take a very tragic turn.
Okay.
December 4th, 1969, Chicago police, working with the FBI, raided Hampton's apartment.
Early in the morning, right?
Yeah, like 4:45 a.m.
While he was sleeping.
Yeah, and what they first said was a huge shootout. Turned out to be something much worse.
Really? The podcast mentioned there was some controversy about the raid.
Oh, yeah.
What really happened?
Well, the official story was that the police were met with a ton of gunfire.
Right.
But later investigations, even forensic evidence, showed a completely different story.
Oh, wow.
It became really clear that almost all the shots fired came from the police.
So they weren't telling the truth?
Not at all. There's even evidence that Hampton was drugged beforehand,
What?
asleep when the raid started,
Oh, my gosh.
and probably never even fired his gun.
So this wasn't some chaotic shootout like the police tried to claim?
Nope.
Sounds more like an assassination.
That's how a lot of people saw it.
Yeah.
And that perception was made even worse by the fact that the police refused to release any information about the raid at first. It just immediately created this cloud of suspicion.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then the cover-up and all the attempts to make Hampton look bad
Right.
just made the outrage and the feeling of injustice so much worse.
It's awful.
It is.
The podcast mentions that Hampton's family filed a civil suit.
They did.
What happened
Yeah.
with that? They ended up winning a $1.85 million settlement
Wow.
against the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and the federal government.
That's huge.
I think that says a lot.
It does.
It suggests that there was a real effort to silence Hampton
Right.
and that people in power were willing to do whatever it took to make that happen.
It's a scary thought
It is.
that those kinds of things can happen,
Yeah.
especially to people who challenge the way things are.
It's a reminder of the risks,
Right.
especially when their message resonates with a lot of people.
So even though he was killed, Hampton's legacy didn't go away.
Not at all. In fact, it continued to grow.
The podcast talks about how different historians look at his life and impact.
Right.
It's really interesting how a single person can be viewed through so many different lenses.
It really shows the power of his story.
It does.
I think it's helpful to break down those different perspectives a bit
Okay.
because they offer valuable insights into how we understand Hampton even today.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that.
So for civil rights revisionist historians,
Okay.
Hampton's story is part of the long fight for social and economic justice,
Right.
a fight that went beyond just integration. They see him as picking up where earlier civil rights leaders left off,
Okay.
but pushing the movement further,
Uh-huh.
demanding a complete restructuring of society
Wow.
to truly address those systemic inequalities.
So they see him as building on what people like Martin Luther King Jr. started,
Exactly.
but realizing that true equality means going after the root causes of poverty and oppression.
Yeah, they argue that Hampton understood that racial justice and economic justice were inseparable.
Okay.
He saw capitalism as a system that was designed to exploit and disenfranchise Black communities,
Yeah,
and believed that dismantling that system was the key to liberation.
that makes sense.
And that's where the Marxist historians come in.
Right. The podcast mentioned that Hampton was heavily influenced by Marxist ideas.
Yes, for Marxist historians.
Okay.
His focus on class struggle is central. They emphasize his critique of capitalism,
Right.
his belief that the system was rigged against the poor and working class,
Okay.
particularly Black Americans who were hit the hardest by that exploitation.
Right.
They see him as part of this global movement for revolutionary change,
Wow.
aligning his struggle with people like Marx, Lenin, and Che Guevara,
Okay.
who all advocated for overthrowing capitalist systems.
So it's not just about racial injustice for them.
No.
It's about how race and class are connected.
Exactly.
And how capitalism makes both forms of oppression worse.
They see Hampton as this visionary leader
Right.
who understood that you can't dismantle racial hierarchies without also dismantling the economic systems that support them.
That's a powerful idea.
It is.
And his call for a rainbow coalition,
Yeah.
uniting all these different groups based on their shared economic struggles,
Right.
shows how much he understood the power of class solidarity.
It's a concept that still resonates today. As more and more people become aware of how wealth inequality and systemic racism are intertwined.
But of course, we can't forget about the historical context.
Right.
The Cold War was happening during Hampton's time,
Mm-hmm.
and the FBI was incredibly suspicious of anything that sounded socialist or communist. How do Cold War historians view his story?
They see Hampton's tragic death as a direct result of that Cold War paranoia. The FBI's intense focus on the Black Panther Party,
Right.
and on Hampton specifically,
Yeah.
is seen as them being terrified that communism was infiltrating American society.
Wow.
They argue that COINTELPRO was driven by an overblown sense of threat,
Okay.
and that Hampton was a tragic casualty of those Cold War tensions.
So they're saying that he was a victim of his time,
In a way,
caught in the middle of this global ideological battle.
they argue that even though Hampton's ideas were radical,
Right.
they were ultimately about achieving social and economic justice, not about bringing down the American government.
Yep.
But that the fear and suspicion of the Cold War made it really hard for people to separate his call for revolutionary change
Yeah.
from this perceived threat of communism.
That's a really important point, because it shows how fear can be used to justify silencing dissent,
Absolutely.
even when those voices are calling for positive change.
Exactly. And then we have the perspective of New Left historians. They focus on Hampton's ability to build coalitions, his charismatic leadership,
Right.
and his embodiment of those core New Left values.
Okay, like what?
Challenging authority, promoting participatory democracy,
Right.
and empowering marginalized communities.
That's where his rainbow coalition concept really shines through, right?
Right, absolutely.
It was like a real-world example of his belief in unity and solidarity.
They admire his ability to bridge those racial and ethnic divides,
Yeah.
bringing those diverse groups together under this common banner of social and economic justice. They see him as a symbol of the New Left's potential to create a more inclusive and equitable society.
It's amazing to think about how much he did
Yeah.
in such a short life.
It really is.
Makes you wonder what he could have accomplished if he had lived longer.
It really does. But his impact goes way beyond just academic debates.
Right. The podcast mentions his presence in rap and hip-hop music.
Huh?
He's almost reached mythical status in Black culture and art.
He's been portrayed as a martyr, a revolutionary icon, a symbol of Black resistance.
Wow.
His image and his words continue to inspire artists and activists today.
Yeah, like Tupac Shakur's song Words of Wisdom,
Right.
which samples Hampton's speeches.
Exactly, or all those murals and works of art that depict him as a symbol of hope and defiance.
It's like his story has become bigger than just the historical context.
Yeah.
He's become a symbol for something larger than himself.
Exactly. He represents that ongoing struggle for equality,
Right.
the fight against oppression, the belief that a better world is possible.
And those ideas never get old, do they?
Never.
But it's not just the ideas.
Right.
It's him, too.
Yeah.
His charisma, his courage, his willingness to stand up for what he believed in,
Right.
even when it was dangerous.
That's what makes him so compelling.
Yeah.
He was a true leader. He inspired people. He mobilized them. He gave them a voice.
And he did all that before he was even 22.
It's incredible.
It makes you think what he could have done if he'd had more time.
It really does. But even in his short life,
Right.
he made a huge impact.
He challenged the system. He built bridges between communities. He gave hope to people who felt marginalized and forgotten.
And that's why I think his story still resonates with us today.
I agree.
It reminds us that even when things seem really unfair,
Yeah.
even when it feels like the odds are stacked against us,
Right.
it's still possible to make a difference. It's still possible to fight for what's right.
That's a powerful message,
It is.
especially these days.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Fred Hampton's life and legacy,
Okay.
what are you left with? What will you take with you from this exploration?
It's amazing, isn't it?
What is?
How even all these years later, Fred Hampton's story can still get people talking.
Oh, yeah.
And even inspire them to take action.
Absolutely.
He wasn't perfect,
No one is.
but his dedication to justice and that incredible ability to bring people together
Yeah.
across racial and economic lines, I mean,
That's remarkable.
that's a legacy worth looking at.
It really is. And what I find so interesting is how much his vision still resonates with movements today.
Oh, totally.
Like, think about the fight for economic equality,
Right.
the push for racial justice,
Yeah.
all those calls for solidarity across different marginalized groups.
It's all connected.
It is. Those threads all go back to what Hampton was talking about in the 60s. He saw how all these issues were linked
Yeah.
long before most people did.
You know, it's one thing to talk about unity, but it's another thing to actually do it.
Oh, absolutely.
Hampton didn't just talk about it.
Right.
He built the Rainbow Coalition,
He did.
bringing together groups that you wouldn't think had much in common.
It's true.
It takes a lot of vision to do something like that.
It does. And it also shows that he really understood power dynamics.
Okay.
He knew that people in power often benefit from keeping groups divided,
Right.
from turning them against each other.
Like a divide and conquer strategy.
Exactly. So by building bridges between Black, brown, and poor white communities,
Yeah.
he was challenging those power structures at their core. He was saying, we're stronger together and we have more in common than you think.
And that message scared the people in power.
It did.
I mean, it's no coincidence that he became a target of the FBI's COINTELPRO program.
Right. They knew he was dangerous.
Yeah.
Not just to their authority, but to that whole system of inequality that kept them on top.
His success threatened everything they stood for.
Exactly. And his assassination. Because let's call it what it was.
Yeah, it was a clear message to anyone else who might try to follow his lead.
Right.
A brutal reminder of the price you might pay.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, but the thing is, they couldn't silence his message completely. His ideas kept spreading.
Right.
And his story still inspires activists and organizers today.
It's like his spirit lives on.
It does.
In the people who are carrying on the fight.
That's the power of a legacy like his.
It is.
He showed us that change is possible. That even when it feels impossible,
Right.
we can still challenge injustice.
And build a better world.
Exactly. And that message will always be important.
Yeah.
As long as there are people fighting for their rights, for their dignity.
For a better future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Fred Hampton's life and legacy, what are you thinking about? What will you take away from all of this?
I think I'm just struck by how important courage is.
Yeah.
The courage to speak truth to power.
Mm.
And to never give up hope for a better world. Those are good takeaways.
Hampton's story shows us that one person can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Even when they're up against incredible challenges.
It's inspiring.
And it makes you think.
About what?
About what we're going to do with what we've learned.
Right.
What will we do with this inspiration we've taken from Hampton's life? How are we going to contribute to the fight for justice and equality?
Those are questions worth thinking about.
They really are.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.